few more people joining us. Thanks so much for coming. We're just doing a quick intro before we jump into the presentation. So before I hand it over to our presenters at Shift, I know many of you are new to For Our Kids. So we wanted to provide a quick overview of who we are and what we do. So For Our Kids is a Canadian nonprofit organization that started in 2019 with the vision of harnessing the powerful, visceral love that parents have for their kids and their instinct to protect them in order to build a constituency of parents to demand more action on climate change. So we are really about supporting parents where they're at and building their capacity to take something on. We believe that you don't need to be an expert to make a meaningful difference and that your love for your kids is a superpower. Today's session is part of the Banking for Our Kids campaign, which aims to empower parents to push banks and our financial system to stop investing in fossil fuels and start investing in a future where our kids can thrive. For Our Kids works with many other advocacy groups on the issue of fossil finance, including our partners on today's call, who are Shift Action for Pension Wealth and Planet Health. And we'd be happy to answer more questions about For Our Kids at the end of the call or in the chat. Thanks to everyone who's sharing their land, their territories in the chat. That's great. So Shift, a quick overview of who Shift is. So today we're going to have a presentation and Q&A with Shift, where we'll learn about Canada's largest pension funds, including the Canadian Pension Plan, and how they're not on track to protect our retirement savings from the climate crisis or to support the transition to a zero carbon future. In fact, Canadian pensions are heavily invested in fossil fuels, which are jeopardizing the very future we're saving for. As beneficiaries, we can demand better from our pension managers. So this info session will learn about Canada's largest pension plans, including the CPP, how they continue to risk our retirement savings on fossil fuels despite the worsening global climate crisis. We'll also learn how you can work with Shift to engage your pension fund to protect your retirement savings and our planet by investing in a just and livable future. So Shift Action for Pension Wealth and Planet Health is a charitable initiative that works to protect pensions and the climate by bringing together beneficiaries and their pension funds on the climate crisis. Shift helps Canadians understand where their retirement wealth is invested by tracking pension fund investments and strategy. Shift educates and empowers Canadians on how to engage constructively with their pension funds to address the climate crisis. So we have Adam Scott and Patrick DeRucci joining us from Toronto today. Adam is the Executive Director at Shift. He's a climate change expert with extensive domestic and international experience in policy, energy, and finance, as well as campaign design and execution. He has a lifelong commitment to supporting the transition to a zero carbon economy in Canada. And at Shift, he works with wide-ranging stakeholders to bring international climate leadership in Canada's financial sector. Patrick is Shift's Senior Manager. He focuses on tracking and analyzing the climate policies and fossil fuel investments of Canadian pension funds and building a network of pension beneficiaries to invest their retirement savings in a zero carbon future. He leads campaigns on the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan, the Public Service Pension Plan, and the Canadian Pension Plan Investment Board. So a couple notes before I pass it over to our presenters. We are recording today's webinar and we'll send that out to you as well as the slides so you can share this info session with friends, family, and colleagues. Closed captioning is on for anyone who might need that today. We will be sharing a couple of polls to get a better sense of how you feel about pension funds and the climate crisis, so keep your eye out for those. We will have a Q&A and discussion at the end, and our presenters will stay here until 8:15, so you'll have some time for a Q&A. Feel free to ask questions at any time during the chat, and we will get to them as we can or cover them at the end of the presentation. So thank you for joining us today, Adam and Patrick. I'll pass it over to you to get us started.
Great. Thanks so much, Gabriel. We're really honored to be here, and we love the For Our Kids network. Worked with them a lot in the past, and just a warning, you may hear my own kids in the background while we're presenting today because it's bedtime around here, but that's okay. I'm going to give you a quick outline of the workshop, the presentation today, just a quick overview. We're going to quickly touch on the context of the climate crisis. We're going to spend a bit of time talking about the financial risks of climate change on big investors like pension funds and what that means for pension funds and members of pension funds like you. We're going to go into a deep dive on the Canada Pension Plan that all Canadians outside of Quebec are a member of. We're going to talk about how you can get involved. And then we'll have some time at the end for a Q&A to ask questions, to discuss what's maybe unclear from the presentation. There's a lot of information in here, so there may be some more discussion needed there. But first, I just wanted to let you know, we're hoping you get a couple of things out of this webinar. The first is that an understanding that the climate is affected by your pension and the decisions that your pension makes. The second is that your pension is affected by the climate crisis and our attempts to address it. And the third is that you have a great deal of power to have influence over both of those pieces. And that's why we think engaging pensions is an incredibly important lever for climate action. So we tend to focus at Shift on Canada's largest pension funds. The 10 largest public pension funds in Canada have over $2.2 trillion in assets under management. And these funds really own the real economy that we live in. So you might have a workplace pension plan as well, but every working and retired Canadian outside of Quebec is a member of the Canada Pension Plan, which manages $575 billion in assets. And every working and retired Quebecer is a member of the Quebec Pension Plan, which manages $424 billion. So you can see just those two plans alone is over $1 trillion. So the decisions on where to invest this huge amount of money are critical to the success or failure of our efforts to address the climate crisis and to reach zero emissions. And they're also critical to being able to pay out your pension. Whether or not you will actually have a pension by the time you retire, if you're a younger person, may well depend on these actions and decisions we're talking about. So I'm going to quickly kick off this presentation by reviewing the context of the climate crisis, as I always like to do, and then we'll get quickly into some of those other pieces. So this graph shows sort of where the climate crisis started, right around the time of the Industrial Revolution, when we started burning coal, oil, and gas. This is carbon that was previously trapped in the ground, has been dumped into the atmosphere, and has significantly upset the balance of energy in our atmosphere. You can see here what that looks like. The concentration of CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere has increased dramatically in a very short period of time. And this is primarily, not exclusively, due to the combustion of fossil fuels. And this is having a huge impact around the world right now. And it's creating a crisis that's accelerating. So we're feeling these impacts every day. We just came out of a really scary summer where it just felt like continual warnings of floods, fires, heat waves, droughts, extreme weather of all kinds hitting us around the world. And so this crisis is already here, and it's already threatening the interconnected global systems that support us. And it's accelerating. So without dramatic intervention, we're going to lock into a future with devastating consequences for ecosystems, for economies, and our communities. And I think everybody on this call probably already knows everything I just said there. But it's important to sort of review. We know what's causing this crisis, and we know what the path out is. This graph, in my view, sort of shows just what we're up against in the path out of the crisis. And really, we have no choice but to cut out the root source of the problem, which is getting off our dependence on fossil fuels and stop combusting fossil fuels. And also to address land use changes from agriculture and deforestation and industrial emissions. But we need an energy transition away from fossil fuels as quickly as possible. And this graph shows what that needs to look like in terms of emissions. The black line is historical emissions to date, and the various colored pathways are paths we can take to stay below the critical 1.5 degree threshold that we're trying to hit, where we can avoid the worst impacts of this crisis. So the two takeaways from this graph are, one, we're not trying to reduce emissions. We're trying to achieve zero. And that's a very different way of thinking. We're not just looking for any kind of marginal reduction we can get. We're looking for a clear path for a zero emissions society in the future. And the second is there's a real cost to inaction. You can see these yellow lines. Had we started taking action in 2000, when this was already a well-understood crisis, the path would be quite smooth and simple. We'd have a lot longer to get there. But as we delay, this gets harder and more difficult. So that's why we're doing what we're doing, and that's why we're pushing so hard on institutions like pension funds to act as quickly as possible. So I want to get into a little bit about why pensions. Why are we talking so much about pensions? And I mentioned this already. The climate crisis is an existential threat to the financial health of pension funds and the wider economy, and as well to the retirement security of pension members. Beneficiaries is what we call them. And second of all, the pension funds are essential to addressing the climate crisis. We simply cannot achieve our climate goals without the trillions of dollars in capital that they manage. We have to actually shift that capital. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the specific legal rules that govern pension funds. They actually show that pension funds have a legal responsibility to act. I'll get into that in a sec. And I didn't want to blow through without talking about the moral case for climate action as well, because I'm going to spend the rest of this conversation talking about financial risks. But I wanted to just stop and say, yes, we really care about the moral case. We think failing to act and investing in fossil fuels is a form of intergenerational theft in many ways. So I just wanted to say that before I move on to talk about the legal responsibility of pensions to act, which is based in this concept of fiduciary duty or fiduciary responsibility. They have a legal obligation to invest in the best long-term interest of their beneficiaries. And that means they have to minimize risks and maximize returns over time, with the goal that somebody who's paying into their pension, just started paying into their pension, will have enough capital to actually have a safe retirement decades in the future. And the climate crisis creates really significant financial risks that could actually impact the fund's ability to pay out. So that currently the pension funds in Canada are largely well-funded and have served their members quite well. But the climate crisis is already a drag on their returns. And, we think pension funds have largely, until very recently, not been paying close enough attention to the risks that they face. And I'm going to go through just very quickly an overview of the sort of many types of systemic and specific financial risk that pension funds and investors of all type are up against right now. The first is the physical risks, the fairly obvious risks that we're seeing every day of a warming world. So fires, floods, heat waves, droughts, sea level rise, extreme weather. They damage the systems and the infrastructure that underpin our economy. And in particular, threaten real estate, utilities, roads, bridges, airports, telecommunications. You can go on and on. That pension funds themselves have large portfolios in. They invest heavily in those types of investments. There's this concept of transition risk, which is essentially, as we go through that energy transition rapidly, there are a lot of winners and losers in markets. And it's not always easy to predict who's going to be a winner or a loser. But in this case, we're seeing a rapid increase in solar, wind, electrification of vehicles, energy efficiency, all sorts of investments taking off. And at the same time, very substantial stranded asset risks for companies that produce oil, gas, and coal, or produce internal combustion engines. And I could go on and on about those. But this transition is already midway, and many players in the market still haven't recognized just what's coming. Regulatory risks, from laws, policies, and regulations to cut carbon pollution. This is pretty straightforward. Carbon pricing, electric vehicle policies, internal combustion engine bans, retrofit plans, emissions caps. I could go on and on. Lots of different kinds of policies are now being rolled out around the world by different governments. We expect those to get more and more stringent over time. And the result is big, rapid changes to the markets that you have to be ahead of. So you have to plan for this to come if you're going to do okay in the market. The legal and reputational risks faced in particular by large incumbents like fossil fuel companies. This is very similar to tobacco lawsuits of the 1990s. Oil and gas companies have been lying about their climate impacts for decades, knowing full well what the impacts are. And this is coming to the courts all over the world, and it's going to have huge implications. And the final category I really wanted to pause on for a second, and this is the one that's least well understood by the pension funds themselves, I would say, is the systemic risk. The kinds of risks that are interconnected across the entire global economy. We might call it a headwind right now. Climate is already reducing GDP growth everywhere around the world. But it's not possible for an individual investor to pick and choose stocks to just stay ahead of this. This impacts everybody. And there are real risks to collapse in the financial system if we see climate crisis getting worse. And there's a lot of scary sort of background to that, but I think it's important to realize we need to see pension funds not just working on their own, but working together across the broader financial system to address this crisis for all of their own good and our well-being as well. And I really wanted to also stop and say, this isn't all doom and gloom. This isn't all negative from a financial perspective. There is massive opportunity. Trillions of dollars are needed to finance this transition that we're already going through. And there is huge exponential growth in a number of industries already underway. So I can say, thankfully, a lot of pension funds are already starting to invest heavily in this area, and we need them to shift a lot more capital in this direction. And I could go on and on about all of the different opportunities there as well, but maybe we can talk about that a little bit later. So I wanted to pause here and ask everybody who's attending to type into the chat if you know which pension fund you're a member of. This is a list of some of the largest ones that we track in Canada. We expect most folks outside of Quebec will be part of CPPIB, which we've highlighted there. We're going to go into a bit of a deep dive. And if you don't know, that's okay too. We can help you figure out which fund you're part of. It's possible to be a member of many different funds. If you want to throw that in the chat, that will help us understand sort of who's on the webinar and maybe get you some more specific information on that. So as I said, we're going to go a little bit deep on Canada Pension Plan tonight because we know everybody's a member of that one, but the approaches are the same for many of the different funds. And here's what we at Shift and in the climate community expect from financial institutions like pension funds to have as a climate plan. I'm going to blow through these quickly, but we need them to have a Paris-aligned target, which is usually expressed in the form of 1.5 degrees, trying to stay as low as possible, below 1.5, often expressed as net zero by 2050, which has some issues. Near-term targets, 5 or 10 years out, so that we know that the long-term target is actually changing the way that they do business now, right this minute. We need them to recognize the urgency of the crisis and their role in solving it. We need them to integrate climate within all of the parts of the organization. So it's not just a couple of staff who are climate experts, but every decision that the fund is making is actually brought through a climate lens. And compensation at the funds should be linked to achieving these targets. Climate engagement means, these pension funds own hundreds, thousands of companies, and they should be directly engaging as owners with these companies to force them to go through the transition along with them. And finally, there are companies that have no path for transitioning. And in those cases, we need to see exclusions and divestment. Shift ran our first ever report card of the largest pension funds in Canada. We released it last January. It's a very detailed, long report, but here's the summary. And you can sort of see roughly in rankings where the different funds show up of the sort of 11 largest. And we can see Canada Pension Plan is sort of bottom middle in that ranking. And yeah, we will be releasing future report card to sort of see how these funds are moving over time. Gabriel's going to launch our first poll. I think I'll just introduce it here. And we just wanted to get a quick snapshot of just how folks on the call right now are feeling about this question of, should my fund be investing in fossil fuels? It's not always clear, and we're really curious to sort of learn what the sort of position of many folks on the call are right now. And it's okay to not be sure about that. That's partly what we're talking about tonight. And I guess I'll hand it over from here over to my colleague, Patrick, who's going to go into a lot more detail about Canada Pension Plan.
Yeah, thanks for that great intro, Adam. And just want to make sure everyone can hear me before I get going. Yep.
Can hear you. Yep.
Um, so with that intro on why our pension funds are such a critical lever for climate action, we're going to do a deep dive on Canada's largest pension fund, and that's the Canada Pension Plan, which is managed by the CPPIB or CPP Investments. And we're focusing on the CPPIB because every Canadian outside of Quebec is a member. If you're a working Canadian outside of Quebec, you have a portion of your paycheck going to this fund every time you get paid. And if you're retired, you are likely collecting a pension from the CPP to supplement your retirement income. And I know that folks in this call, I can see in the chat that you might be a member of other pension plans, and we do have a lot of info on those. But we're going to try and make this presentation inclusive for folks across the country. And it is very likely that if you're outside of Quebec, you're a member of the CPPIB, but please do reach out to us if you're looking for similar information about other large public pension funds in Canada. So on the next slide, it's just kind of a good idea to go over how the CPPIB works. The money that you put away each year isn't actually enough on its own to pay for your eventual pension. To get enough funds to do that, the money needs to be grown every year through investments, which is where the CPPIB comes in. If they're not doing that, it can face a shortfall and it might have trouble paying out your pensions in the long run. So it needs to continue to grow through the CPPIB's investment activities. Your pensions aren't just sitting there in a savings account. They're invested by a very highly sophisticated investment manager in real companies and stocks and bonds, index funds, a number of other financial products. But just remember that these are your deferred wages, and the CPPIB is a crown corporation that works for you. It is a very well managed fund that has done well for Canadians so far. It's one of the largest pension funds in the world. About 21 million Canadians outside of Quebec are members. Its mandate is to invest the CPP assets with a view to achieving a maximum rate of return without undue risk of loss. And I want to just underscore undue risk of loss in the context of the climate crisis. And of course, it's a global investor with giant investments in financial products and companies, assets, infrastructure all over the world. And we'll talk more about those different areas of the economy that's invested in, particularly in the energy sector. On the next slide, Adam mentioned we released this Canadian Pension Climate Report Card early this year, an analysis we took comparing and contrasting how Canadian pension funds are managing the risks of climate change. CPP came in around a C minus. We are expecting the CPP to release a sustainable investment report later this fall, and we hope to see a big improvement in that score, but it really is in the middle of the pack right now. And we also gave the CPP a gold star for greenwashing as part of this report because we found a very troubling pattern of the CPP trying to convince us that its investment activities and companies it owns are doing more environmentally friendly or less environmentally damaging things than they really are. But credit where credit is due. CPP has taken a significant positive steps to understand climate risk and implement an effective response to the climate crisis. It's developed a comprehensive climate plan and several think pieces on the energy transition and decarbonization. It recognizes these risks and opportunities of climate change that we're talking about. It has a commitment to net zero emissions by 2050, including scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. It's making really big investments in climate solutions. It has its own framework to assess how different companies and industries have a pathway to decarbonization. And it's also testing the resilience of our pension savings against different global warming scenarios that might play out. And like I mentioned, really big investments in climate solutions here. This is a graph showing the growth in renewable energy investments that the CPP has made in recent years. In some cases, it actually owns its own renewable energy development companies. So it's financing building wind farms and utility scale solar all over the world. It issues billions of dollars in green bonds to finance climate solutions and emissions reductions. It's a big investor in the electric vehicle supply chain, from manufacturing facilities to batteries to charging stations. It has a giant real estate portfolio in financial capitals all over the world of green certified buildings. It's investing in other solutions like energy storage, efficiency and conservation, smart grids, green hydrogen, sustainable agriculture. So it really is capitalizing on the surging demands for decarbonization and smartly investing our national pension fund in these low carbon industries, products, and companies, and also providing capital to help carbon intensive industries find pathways to decarbonize. But despite this progress, we do see some big limitations in CPP having a credible climate plan. For one thing, despite that net zero target, it has refused to set interim targets, whether that's 2025, 2030, 2040, on its way to getting to net zero. And it also has no limits on carbon offsets so far. It also, we see this troubling obfuscation of what the CPPIB intends to be climate solutions versus what we see as dangerous distractions. In particular, they're making big investments and own a lot of infrastructure in carbon capture and storage, as well as gas pipelines. And they do this thing where they have it all under the umbrella of a sustainable energies portfolio, but we don't actually know why they consider certain companies in that portfolio to be considered sustainable. We also don't have any disclosure of decarbonization pathways for hard to abate industries, fossil fuels in particular. There's little evidence from the CPP that its engagement of fossil fuel companies is actually effective in getting these oil and gas companies to reduce emissions. And it doesn't even consistently vote for climate-related shareholder proposals at oil and gas company AGMs. In addition to that, it really is a huge investor in oil and gas companies. And in some cases, as I'll talk about, it actually privately owns fossil fuel companies and their infrastructure. And we've noticed this year that they continue to finance fossil fuel expansion, despite the fact that Canada was largely on fire this summer. So on this next slide, we've asked CPP many times, as have thousands of Canadian beneficiaries, for an inventory of their fossil fuel assets, which they have not provided. But we have made a big effort to map their portfolio and find out all the fossil fuels that are in it. They said around this time last year that they had about $22 billion invested in fossil fuel producers alone. I just put the top 10 holdings they have in Canadian dollars in their public equity portfolio. You can see a series of oil and gas producers, oil sands companies, pipeline companies, gasoline stations. They're heavily invested in public companies that are involved in fossil fuels. And of course, the problem here is that these fossil fuel producers don't actually have a viable pathway to decarbonization other than phasing them out, phasing out production. The climate science is clear and unambiguous on this. The continued financial success of these companies is dependent on expanding and prolonging the use of fossil fuels. And this will, of course, ensure climate disaster, which undermines our own collective retirement security and the CPPIB's own mandate to minimize risk. The CPP says it needs to own these companies so it can influence and engage them, but these companies don't have a pathway to align their business model with a safe climate future. These are oil and gas companies. Their core business is extracting, refining, and transporting fossil fuels. They don't have plans to change, and they don't have credible plans to align with net zero in the Paris Agreement. The production of fossil fuels needs to be rapidly phased out in order to minimize risk to this fund. And of course, we've seen this pattern of the CPP refusing to acknowledge this scientific fact that we need to urgently phase out fossil fuels. We've documented at least 15 instances over the last couple of years where CPP executives have refused to acknowledge this basic scientific consensus that we need to phase out fossil fuels. And we really have to ask why they won't admit this scientific truth. And one explanation that we have come across is that, of course, the CPP privately owns a lot of oil and gas companies and fossil fuel infrastructure all over the world. I've put some examples here of companies in their portfolio, and it's pretty tough for an investor to acknowledge the need to phase out fossil fuels when they actually own the pipes in the ground or the oil rigs or the carbon capture infrastructure that's transporting carbon dioxide. So just a few examples here. They own this company on the top left, Civitas Resources, which is a Denver-based oil and gas producer. They own Neffin Energy, which is an Irish gas producer that extracts offshore gas off the coast of Ireland. Calpine Energy is a private oil and gas electricity generator in the US, the largest generator of gas from gas plants in the country. This country here, Wolf Midstream, is actually a owner of the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line, which transports carbon to be used in increased oil sands production in Alberta. And it also owns the Access Pipeline System, which transports gas and diluent to enable oil sands production. I don't want to go over all these, it'll take me too long, but I will highlight the one on the bottom left, Era Energy. And that just came up this March when not only did the CPP already own these fossil fuel companies, but they're actually doubling down and buying more oil companies. Era Energy is California's second largest oil and gas producer, responsible for about 25% of the state's production. And they spent money just this March to buy Era Energy, adding fossil fuels to our pension portfolio. Next slide, the other reason we think that there's this big reluctance on the part of the CPP to acknowledge the need for a fossil fuel phase out is just how entangled the fund is with the fossil fuel industry itself. This graphic is a bit dated. It's from a report we put out about a year and a half ago where we mapped all the different overlap between pension fund executives and boards and fossil fuel companies. And we found with the CPP that currently 4 of its 12 directors are either also a director of an oil and gas company or an executive at an oil and gas company. The new chair of the board is actually the former president and CEO of Sun Life Insurance, which is, of course, the largest investor in fossil fuels among Canadian financial institutions. The former chair of its board is the former chair of the Royal Bank of Canada, which we know is the largest financier of fossil fuels among global banks in the world. And even another director of CPP was the former CEO of RBC Global Asset Management. So we see a board of directors that's heavily entangled with not just fossil fuel companies, but the banks and insurance companies that are financing fossil fuel companies. And it's hard to believe that people that are that entangled in the industry, that have interests in fossil fuel expansion, are going to come out and say and recognize the need to phase out oil and gas. In addition to climate risks, there is one other thing we want to highlight, and that's that we need to see Indigenous rights policies from Canadian pension funds, in particular the Canada Pension Plan, because it's a federal crown corporation. And we need to see that they're factoring Indigenous rights into their investment processes. They have a clear role to play in the process of reconciliation that we're undergoing right now. They're massive asset owners. And we need to make sure that these pension funds like CPP are respecting the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the impact of their activities and their investments on the lands and waters of Indigenous peoples. So this is a really important point that we haven't seen any Canadian pension fund come out with a comprehensive Indigenous rights policy for the 21st century. I'm going to loop back to what Adam said about what constitutes a credible climate plan, and we're seeing some pieces come together at the CPP, so they do have that high-level commitment to net zero emissions by 2050, and they're making really big investments in the solutions we need to see to go through the energy transition. But we're seeing them lacking on most other points here. They don't have a short, medium, and long-term plan with dates, targets, and pathways to decarbonize. We need to see them actually move forward their plan to decarbonize ahead of 2040. We need to see an immediate screen on new oil, gas, and coal investments, and then a plan to phase out its current oil, gas, and coal investments by 2025. And on that engagement part, we really need to see them using their influence and ownership of companies to start really getting those companies to get serious about decarbonization. That means linking executive compensation to emissions reductions. It means requiring companies in their portfolio to have credible pathways to net zero emissions. And it means forbidding those companies from lobbying to undermine and block climate policy. And of course, like I mentioned, we do want to see the CPP and other pension funds develop an Indigenous rights policy. And of course, the CPP is in the business of making money, and we want to make sure that our pension funds are making money and are able to pay out our pensions in the future. So we always get asked, if pension funds have to say invest in fossil fuel companies to generate the kind of returns they need to pay. And the answer is unequivocally no. This is research last year from Corporate Knights of major Canadian pension funds, and it demonstrates that in every single case, the public equity portfolio of these funds would have generated better returns if they'd eliminated investments in oil and gas companies on the stock market 10 years ago. The CPP's public equity portfolio would have outperformed by nearly 20% had it divested 10 years ago. So divestment from fossil fuels is actually a way to reduce risk and volatility in the portfolio and leads to better long-term returns. It's simply a smart financial decision. And we're seeing this trend, of course, play out all over the world. Last year, we saw Europe's biggest pension fund in the Netherlands ditch fossil fuels. We've seen the New York State public pension plan divest fossil fuels. About $40 trillion US in investments globally have now completely or partially excluded coal, oil, and gas, and including approaching 200 pension funds. So this is not radical ask. This is happening all over the world. And the CPP and Canada Pension Plan are really falling behind on this. And of course, when pension funds do this, they report back that it either had no impact on returns or a positive impact on returns, and they never regret it. So this is becoming a very standard mainstream thing to do for institutional investors like pension funds, and we're not seeing that's replicated in Canada at this point. So what can you do? This is really the really important part here. And the first thing I'll say is that you can go to shiftyourpension.ca right now and send a letter to your pension fund, whether it's the Canada Pension Plan or if you're a member of a different pension plan. Go there. It's just like a tool to send a letter to your MPP or to your counselor. It sends it to responsible investment managers and key executives at the funds. It also allows you to keep in touch with us so that we can give you news, updates, and future opportunities for action. I'd also encourage you to go check out our website so you can read our Canadian Pension Climate Report Card. We have detailed information, such as this with the CPP, on 10 other Canadian funds. Please follow us on social media. I'm going to get my colleagues to put us in the chat. We're constantly posting about Canadian pension funds, climate policies, their fossil fuel investments, and how they're approaching these risks. And of course, we do have organizing groups of key pension funds, particular Ontario teachers, Ontario healthcare workers, and Ontario municipal employees, as well as BC's public pension funds out west. So if you're a member of any of those big public pension funds in BC or Ontario, we have very active groups with monthly meetings that we would love for you to join and get involved in our campaign. We're doing all kinds of things to raise the profile of this issue and raise the voices of beneficiaries like you. It might look like writing letters to the editor, writing op-eds in your local newspaper. It might mean writing individual letters to your pension fund. In some cases, we've set up meetings with pension managers and beneficiaries. We'll have people attend annual general meetings or union meetings to raise the profile of this issue. Last year, there was a big public information session for the CPP across the country, and we made sure that we got people out to those and asking climate-related questions. And I do want to just note on the bottom left here the role of unions here, because a lot of times our big public sector unions are sponsors of these pension funds, or in some cases appoint members to the board of these pension funds. So they have a real voice in how these pensions are governed and how they want to see these pension funds approaching the climate crisis. So we really want to work together with our allies in the labor sector to make sure that we have a voice from labor calling for climate-aligned pensions. On the next slide, just another couple of examples here. We were featured on the national earlier this year. Teachers, public sector workers, healthcare workers, featuring their voices and why they don't want to see their retirement savings invested in the fossil fuel companies that are destroying their future. Another couple of examples of actions we've had, as well as op-eds. And I'll just note here that the pension funds are listening and taking action. We've seen just in the few years that we've been doing this work that they really are listening to the voices of their members and taking action to improve the way they're managing these risks. In some cases, we are seeing pension funds develop comprehensive climate plans. In some cases, we're starting to see restrictions on investments in coal. In Quebec, we've already seen the CDPQ, which manages the Quebec pension plan, no longer investing in oil production because they are listening to the voices of their members, and we're bringing these concerns to them and they're acting on it. These are a couple of examples here of the CEOs of the Canada Pension Plan and the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan actually acknowledging that they're hearing from their beneficiaries about this and why they need to align their portfolio with climate safety. And I'll just reiterate one more time that, we did a deep dive on the Canada Pension Plan tonight, but we do have similar levels of information for these other funds. So please reach out to us if you haven't already about information on these funds. We really want to grow a movement of people that are talking and engaging to their pension funds about this. And we have the power to actually make these changes because they are required to respond to their members and protect your pensions as the climate crisis worsens. And I'll just end it off with this slide to kind of get across the importance of this lever for climate action. Obviously, we all want to kind of do things in our personal lives to reduce our own personal carbon footprint. You might want to get an electric vehicle or eat less meats or maybe fly a little bit less to reduce those emissions from your personal life. But the real leverage point we have for systemic mass emissions reductions is through our investments. When we talk about the $2 trillion invested by just those 10 largest pension funds in Canada, even if we can shift 1% of those out of fossil fuels and into climate solutions, that's $20 billion that we're moving. And it has a lot more impact than those small changes we can make in our daily lives. So that's why we've been doing this work, because we've recognized that this is a big leverage point for decarbonization and climate action that a lot of Canadians can be a part of. And I'll end it there, but we are going to do a Q&A, and I'll turn it over to Gabrielle to report back on the first poll question and launch the second poll question.
Thanks, Patrick. Yeah, so thank you to everyone for participating in the first poll. I can share the results maybe. We did have, majority of folks are really strongly in favor of, strongly disagree with their pension investing in fossil fuels, so that's great to see, and I'm sure this presentation helped to sort of clarify that further. So we're gonna launch the second poll based on all the great actions that were shared with us by Shift. So there are a number of different ways you can get involved. So if you want to take a few minutes to let us know what you might be interested in doing, that would be great. Maybe we can get those options on the slide too. So while people answer that poll, maybe we'll quickly move towards the Q&A. So yeah, so there you have a lot of your options, and we'll take those answers as you share them. So we had a few questions from our chat. One of the first ones is, does Shift delve into the validity of carbon credits, and how does Shift view net zero as a goal?
Yeah, I can jump in on that one. Carbon credits, the market right now for carbon credits has a lot of issues, and really it comes down to just accounting. It's been discovered over and over and over again that the majority of credits that are currently out there are fraudulent in some capacity, and they're not what we call additional. So you might get a carbon credit for saying I'm going to protect a piece of forest, but when you look closely, they'll find that piece of forest was already protected before it got turned into a carbon credit. And it's also possible for forests that are generating credits to burn down, which is something that's also happened recently. And so there's a lot of fraud, there's a lot of creative accounting, there's a lot of uncertainty in the credit market. And as well, I would say there's really no such thing as a real carbon offset in the market. And it's an issue it's worth raising as well, because some of the pension funds are actually investing in companies that manage or create carbon offsets. So this is, I think an issue that's going to come to a head in the next couple of years. When it comes to talking about net zero by 2050, that's a concept that's actually about global emissions. So what that's trying to encapsulate is that there are some places in the world that are not going to be able to get to zero by 2050. And the global concept of equity and common but differentiated responsibility means that in particular, the poor developing countries around the world will take longer and struggle to achieve zero emissions. And that's going to take some time. There are also some sectors that are incredibly hard to decarbonize. And so that's a recognition on. And what that means is that everyone else actually has to go faster in order for us to achieve a global net zero by 2050 goal. So for rich countries like Canada, with all of the means and opportunity and historical responsibility for our emissions, we need to be going much faster. And that's why you're seeing a call for hitting zero emissions by 2040 or earlier. One of our pensions, the University Pension Plan in Ontario, has set a 2040 target, for example. So yes, and of course, the absolute minimum use of credits or offsets should be part of that. We would say we don't want to see any offsets included in targets for investors. There's no need for that. I know that's quite a complicated thing to dive into on one question, but and Patrick, feel free to add anything if you like.
I'll leave it at that, but I will just mention, and I'll put this in the chat later, that the CPP has done a lot of thinking on this and actually has a white paper on carbon credits and the role that they think it will play in the net zero transition. And we've seen several big investments from the CPP in the carbon credit market that we're quite concerned about because it allows polluters to continue polluting and allows them to greenwash their own net zero plans. So we are calling for pension funds to put at least a limit on the amounts of offsets that they'll allow in their net zero commitments, to make sure that they're actually reducing emissions in the real economy and not relying on false carbon credits to get to those net zero commitments.
Thanks so much, Adam and Patrick. I have another question here that was sort of addressed at the beginning of your presentation, but maybe we can speak to it a bit again. So how have pension plans done financially when they withdraw or divest from fossil fuels? Is there a projection for this for the CPP in terms of earnings and sustainability when investing in other industries?
Yeah, I mean, as Patrick showed in his slides, the funds that we track would have done better. It's possible to look backwards at what the market did do over a 10-year period, and what we've seen is that the fossil fuel sector has underperformed really over the last 15 years, not just the last 10. And the reason is it's a really volatile cyclical market, but there's disruption happening already. The transition away from using fossil fuels for transportation has already started. And it's a volatile, messy sector. So we can already sort of show that historically they would have done better. And looking forward, we can see that there's this obvious structural decline coming in the fossil fuel market, which doesn't necessarily mean that oil prices will collapse overnight or anything like that, or that everybody will stop using fossil fuels overnight. But we expect to see a large number of producers competing over a shrinking market. And the International Energy Agency just confirmed last week that even with existing policies in place, we expect coal, oil, and gas demand to peak within the next decade. We're hoping they will peak even faster than that as we continue to increase the ambition. So that's sort of looking forward at the risks. And what we've seen and what a lot of investors are seeing is that the risks are just too high to be worth it. If you exclude fossil fuels, it's a relatively small percentage of global markets, and they're capable of generating much higher returns in other places. So it's just the opportunity cost. Go invest in something that's growing exponentially. And frankly, that's in the solutions to climate sector. If we look at really any of the climate solutions, the major climate solutions, a good example might be heat pumps are rapidly replacing fossil gas furnaces and boilers around the world right now. And there's just a limitless growth potential there. So you're better off having your pension savings invested there. And we can say that with quite a bit of confidence.
Anything to add, Patrick, or we'll move on to the next one?
Go ahead to the next one.
Yeah, okay. I think this is sort of a question about emission scope and thinking about net zero. So someone has said, I hope we can convince the government that a zero target considers the emissions from forest fires, for example. My understanding is that BC does not count those emissions in its total emission count, and we're not sure about other provinces. So I was wondering if you could speak to that scope of risk and emission accounting.
Sure. I mean, it's a huge issue in the way that we account for carbon. And I think carbon accounting is one of those very dry sounding, very complicated and technical pieces that underlies a lot of the discussion we have about climate. But it's amazing what you count and what you don't count can make all of the difference. And in Canada has been trying to count our forests as a sink, as a positive for our climate accounting for decades. And the reality has been it's been a negative for some time now. And as the climate crisis accelerates, it's becoming more and more of a negative. And we've seen, what was the estimate, Patrick, we saw on the impact of the fires of just this summer, but it was like an order of magnitude more than Canada's annual emissions was one estimate we saw. So it's really quite disturbing to think that. So yes, and I think the forest piece it also relates back to the offsets conversation. Is most of the offsets, quote unquote, that are out there in the market, the majority of them are actually based on for what we call forest offsets, which means we're deferring logging of a protected forest, or trying to capture carbon by planting trees, and there's just no certainty that carbon won't go back into the atmosphere. There's no permanence, and I think the forest fires we saw this summer are part of that as well. So we have a lot of concerns there.
I think the other thing I'll mention about emissions accounting is that what's interesting about the CPPIB's net zero commitment is that it covers scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, as I mentioned. And to just explain that, scope 1 emissions are those from the operation, or those that a company is directly responsible for. Scope 2 emissions are those from the power that the company is purchasing. And then scope 3 emissions are actually the emissions from the end use of the products that the company is producing. So in the case of fossil fuel companies, the vast majority of those emissions are scope 3 emissions when the fuel is burned in the gas tank of a car, or in a furnace, for example. So the CPP is committed to actually zero out those scope 3 emissions. And of course, the only way to do that is to phase out fossil fuel production altogether. There's no way to attach carbon capture and storage to the tailpipe of a car or to a furnace. We actually need to stop production to avoid emissions from the fossil fuel sector. And that's why it's so perplexing that we see the Canada Pension Plan continue to invest in more fossil fuel production when they've committed to go in the opposite direction with their net zero commitments. So scope 3 emissions are going to start being required to be accounted for by financial institutions and by companies. It's already happening in some jurisdictions. And it's going to create even greater risk for oil and gas companies because they will become responsible for the end use of their emissions and need to be driven down.
Thanks for that, both. That was helpful. As a more simple question here, how do CPP directors get appointed?
Patrick, do you want to take that one?
Yeah. So there's regional representation on the CPP board, and there's also input from provincial finance ministers as well as the federal finance minister. So there's a nonpartisan independent nominating committee that will bring forward a series of suggested directors for appointments, and then eventually the federal finance minister actually appoints them to the board. So you'll see kind of regional representation across the provinces on the CPP, and the ultimate decision is made by the finance minister. So it is an apolitical process. I'm not exactly sure how, in the bowels of Canada's federal bureaucracy, they actually come up with those appointments. But it is clear that, they are tending to choose people that, like I said, are quite entangled with large companies in Canada. That includes oil and gas companies and the banks that are financing them, of course.
Yeah, I'll just add that that's a particular problem because if you're making a decision about climate policies for a major pension fund, and you have another personal vested interest or a legal interest as the director of a company that has fossil fuel business, you're conflicted. And the conflict of interest rules that govern boards would require that director to step out of the room on any discussion. And first of all, that's just not great when you have a big chunk of your board stepping out for conflict of interest reasons. But we're not confident that they are stepping out. We're worried that there are conflicts of interest occurring in the boardroom, and because we don't have transparency on how boardroom minutes, we don't know. But that's something that's a real problem. But they really should be stepping out, because the implications of the Canada Pension Plan saying, for example, we want to screen for fossil fuels will have an impact on those companies financially, and so you can sort of see how those conflicts become a real problem.
Yeah, just to put that into perspective too, I'll give an example on the Federal Public Service Pension Plan, which is managed by PSP Investments. One of the directors of that pension fund also sits on the board of Imperial Oil. So when this discussion about accelerating climate action or phasing out fossil fuels come up at the pension fund board, can you imagine a director of Imperial Oil saying, we're going to phase out fossil fuels? That would be in conflict with the purpose of the shareholders of Imperial Oil. So that really puts into perspective why we think there's a conflict between protecting your retirement security and investing your retirement savings for the long term, and being on the board of a fossil fuel company that, of course, is making money off expanding oil and gas. These two things are incompatible.
Thanks for that. I think that segues nicely into our next question, which is about greenwashing. So someone's kind of noted, there's a lot of massive public relations campaigns going on. Most recently in Alberta, they're playing on the fear that the Canadian government green energy plan will make electricity unaffordable and our devices not work. How does SHIFT think these fearful campaigns can best be countered? Facts do not appear to be sufficient. And this person compares them to pro-tobacco ads, but we do have time to do something about fossil fuels right now. So how do we counter this sort of greenwashing?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really rampant problem. And for all of the good work that's occurring across the country to start getting the financial system to and corporations to have transition plans and to start caring about the climate and aligning themselves, this greenwash is undermining all of that. We can't trust the statements of a bank, for example, who says we're gonna issue transition aligned finance, because that could mean, and it has meant in some cases, well, we'll give a large revolving credit facility to Enbridge to expand oil pipelines. It's rampant and it's across the country and it's a real issue. So we've seen there is a regulator, the Canadian Competition Bureau, that has jurisdiction over false advertising. So there've been several complaints. One for the Pathways Alliance, the group of oil sands companies that are greenwashing heavily around their potential to align with climate targets. That is in process, and there's also been a greenwashing complaint registered against RBC, similarly for their creation of a net zero plan or a target without actually having the plan in place to meet it, and advertising around that fact. But this is an ongoing problem. So the solution is, frankly, regulation and enforcement. And we have been working at SHIFT along with a number of other partners on calling for financial regulation that blocks greenwash. And that's something that we're organizing on, and you're going to start to see a lot more activity in the next coming months. So we will have activities for our supporters that can send a letter specifically calling for that regulation, and other groups we work with will as well. So if you haven't seen that yet, watch this space. But we need to be calling on the federal finance minister in particular to step in with climate regulation to regulate banks, insurers, pension funds, and corporations, to make sure that they can't get away with using terms like net zero or green or other common sort of representations about something being in line with climate action when quite the opposite is true.
Thanks, Adam. We have a couple questions here that are sort of similar around well, the primary responsibility of the pension plans board is to deliver replacement income, not to make calls on the environment. And it's taxpayers who guarantee the plan who must sign off. So how do you get them to do that? And someone similarly said, are you replacing the investment professionals? If there is a risk, shouldn't the investment professionals be making those calls? So maybe you can speak to that kind of complexity.
Yeah, we recognize the purpose of a pension fund is to meet the fiduciary responsibility, the financial requirements of the fund. And that's where we often have heard that, okay, well, it's not our responsibility to care about the climate, we're here to just make money, which is actually a view that signals that those fund managers don't understand the climate crisis fundamentally and how the scope and the sweeping danger that it presents to the financial system. Mark Carney, who's the former head of the Bank of Canada and the former head of the Bank of England and the chair of the Financial Stability Board, was really clear about this, that there's a very strong risk to the global financial system of disruption and collapse if we fail to address this crisis at a systemic level. We expect to see what they call rapid repricing incidents. If we're going to see stranded assets, for example, a fossil fuel company suddenly losing a large chunk of its value overnight, it's not going to happen incrementally. It's going to happen all of a sudden as the market wakes up to these risks. And that risk still exists. So in addition to sort of the general underperformance of fossil fuel sectors and other high carbon sectors, there are these really serious lurking risks. And it is absolutely the job of pension managers to be looking ahead and trying to minimize those. And they have a number of complicated strategies that they deploy to counter risk. And having a strong climate plan that meets all of the things we've said today is the way that they do that. So that's where we're really sort of focused on getting these funds to have professionals internally to understand what we're talking about and to act. And if they do that, the fund will perform better, not just in the short term, but especially over the long term. And that's fundamentally, you know, I think the frame we use to talk about this.
Thanks, Adam. That was helpful. What are your thoughts on divesting from banks in investment portfolios? It's a bit outside the scope, but and also relatedly, are there any thoughts about blacklisting financial firms who invest in fossil fuels?
Yeah, it's a complicated issue because the interconnectedness of the financial system and markets is it's always challenging to say. It's very easy to say, okay, this fossil fuel company's business model is totally out of line with the direction of travel we're headed, and it's actually fairly straightforward to sort of see how that might not make financial sense. I think, you know, banks do have climate risks. They're different than those of a pension fund. They're much shorter term. So like a bank always has huge volumes of loans out in the market, and the risk is a lot more short term, like a couple of years is sort of the length of those loans. But I do think that there's a very real risk and a growing one in investing in any bank in particular that carries a huge loan book for fossil fuel industries. And that's something, you know, RBC was flagged last year as the world's largest financier of fossil fuels over a period of time. And so you can see there's quite a large and growing risk there that investors want to pay attention to. And I think there's reputational risks as well. I think people care about this. A lot of individuals, when they learn that their banks are heavy financiers of fossil fuel expansion, they're looking to switch. And I think there's been a growing movement towards people trying to move where their money is invested over time, or where they're keeping their bank accounts, and trying to work with ethical and responsible companies. So that can also hurt the valuations of those banks over the long term as well. So I do think this is a really real issue for investors to think about. And yeah, it's coming up a lot at the AGMs of those banks. Investors are already giving them a very hard time about having net zero plans and not having a credible plan to meet them. So I expect to see quite a few sparks on that over the coming years.
Yeah, the Canadian pension funds that we track, they're really big investors in Canada's big five banks. They hold billions of dollars worth of shares in RBC and TD and CIBC, etc. And we're seeing this, like Adam mentioned, this series of climate-related shareholder proposals come up at banks' AGMs now, where investors and shareholders are calling on the banks to stop financing fossil fuel expansion or put in place a credible climate strategy for their loan book. And in some cases, the Canadian pension funds are actually voting for those climate-related shareholder proposals. And it's another example of where they have real power to influence the trajectory of the finance industry and its emissions reductions pathway by leveraging their power as a shareholder in the big banks. And in some cases, we've actually seen European pension funds that have committed to divest from fossil fuels and then focus their engagement on insurance companies and on banks instead of oil and gas companies, because that's where they see leverage to really decarbonize the economy and stop fossil fuel expansion. So there's a really big interplay here that we need to see Canada's pension funds start voting for strong climate action from the banks.
Thanks for tying that together. We have a question here about nuclear. mostly in Ontario. The Ontario government is investing in nuclear instead of cheaper, safer, faster renewable options like wind, solar, conservation, etc. Is there pension investment into nuclear and companies involved like at SNC Lavalin, or is it all paid for by the Ontario public with federal input from Canadians generally? Do you have any comment on this shift in investment?
The answer is yes. There is exposure across some of the pension funds. I'd say it's a relative minority, but a couple of funds like OMERS is a good example. They have a stake in Bruce Power, a big Ontario nuclear producer, and as well in the supply chain. So that does exist. I would say it's an industry that lives and dies almost entirely on public subsidy, and that does for all of the many problems that creates, it shields the investors a little bit from some of the risk, but there are pretty substantial risks there. Nuclear investments have been strong in the past because there's been strong public support for them. So you're not going to find any nuclear private nuclear investments anywhere in the country or internationally. They're all government backed somewhere in most cases. And in the future, we're talking about new investments. Building a nuclear reactor might take 15 or 20 years, a tremendous cost and risk, and it's not really something that we're likely to see, strong returns on or anything in the near term. It's really dependent on government subsidy. So I'll say that, but there is some exposure in the funds.
The other thing I'll just add to that, Janice, especially in relation to Ontario, is that we'll be lucky with the nuclear industry's history of cost overruns and delays in the regulatory process and construction. We'll be lucky if we see those new nukes get built by 2035. And sure, maybe they'll produce carbon-free power then, but we need emissions reductions now. So you can, build utility scale solar in 6 months. You can build an offshore wind farm in 18 months. So when it comes to deploying climate solutions, it's just much cheaper and faster to deploy wind, solar, battery storage immediately than wait for over a decade for nuclear plants to come online.
Thanks so much, Adam and Patrick. And maybe you'll see this question in the chat from Ted, but is it a fair question to ask why fossil fuel companies, with encouragement from shareholders, pension managers, etc., are not progressively increasing their share of investments in renewable energy to shift, if not increase their value going forward? What's the holdup, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, I mean, they're not good at it. Renewable energy, a lot of fossil fuel companies over the years have gone through cycles of saying, yes, we're committed to transitioning. We're going to put a small percentage of our capital expenditure towards new renewable projects. And that's been the case with a number of big international fossil fuel companies, including the Canadian oil sands players. They've built smaller, medium-sized renewable portfolios. And every 5 years or so, they've built up a debt on their balance sheet, and they're looking to sort of simplify. And the first thing they sell is all of the renewable assets. So we've seen round after round of Enbridge and Suncor and BP and Shell completely selling off their renewable portfolios and saying, we're going to concentrate on the thing we do well, which is oil and gas. And it's a totally different business model. So there's nothing stopping a fossil fuel company from investing in fossil fuels. But the reality is, if they want to do it, it makes sense to just create a new company. And that's where we're seeing a lot of big utilities in particular actually just creating whole new divisions. Because, if you think about an oil company, they have huge liabilities for abandoned wells, for tailings ponds, for all sorts of expenses. And those are also on their balance sheet. So from an investor perspective, if you say, I'm not going to invest in any company that generates even a small percentage of its revenue and above from fossil fuels, those companies could just say, great, we'll just create a new green company that only invests in renewables. And that would be investable. And that wouldn't fall under the screen. And so that's the reality of what's going to happen and what is happening in the very rare cases where we see fossil fuel companies trying to transition or to invest in clean energy. They usually just do it through a new company. And that's an effective strategy. But if you look at Suncor just this summer, just like 2 months ago, just said, you know what, we've been talking way too much about this transition nonsense. We're going to go back to basics, and we're going to focus on what we do well, which is oil sands. And all of those years of greenwash and talking about renewables and having that on the cover of their annual report, just down the toilet, back to basics again. So it's you only get burned so many times before you go, okay, these companies are not serious about this.
Anything to add, Patrick? Or
Yeah, I guess I'll just add that, that is why we've drawn a really clear line in the sand about oil and gas producers in particular, because they are awash in cash this year after record profits since the Ukraine war. And they're still not investing that money in energy transition and renewables. They're still doubling down on exploring and producing more oil and gas. They're still lobbying against climate action. They're still attaching executive compensation to growing production. So even when they have all the money in the world, they're still not committing to decarbonizing. And that means that the investor engagement of fossil fuel companies has failed. It is futile to get these companies to reduce to change their business model. And there is no pathway to changing their business model other than phasing out production. And that's why we've been very clear that we support engagement of other high carbon sectors like cement or steel or utilities or mining or transports, because they have pathways to decarbonization. Fossil fuel producers do not. They need to be phased out. So if the pension funds are serious about climate action and reducing emissions from the oil and gas industry, then they should be actually advocating for strong climate policies from the federal and provincial governments to drive down emissions and reduce production, not saying that they're going to have a friendly meeting with an oil and gas company and somehow that's going to lead to them changing their business model, because it's not happening. And they've had years for that to happen and it's failed.
thanks, Patrick. Very quickly before you end, can you say a little bit more about those legislative regulatory tools? What do we want and what would work well? And are there things in the works that we should be watching?
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, Canada has a legally binding climate target, and it's enshrined in legislation federally. And we're looking at a number of regulations coming in for different industries. There's a discussion about an oil and gas emissions cap right now, for example. But the finance industry is completely unregulated on climate. And so what we really want to see is financial institutions over a certain size, corporations over a certain size to start with, be required by regulators to have a climate plan, and then be required to report on it publicly and their progress against it annually in their financial statements. And that alone is enough to drive the change that we need to see within those institutions. So that's what we're calling for from financial regulators in particular. That's the main tool we'd like to see, and it would have a big systemic impact. I know we're running up against the end of time here, and folks are needed to head out, and so happy to keep chatting, but I think, yeah, I can see.
Yeah, maybe we'll wrap it up here. I think if you have follow-up questions, Ship would be happy to hear from you. We'll definitely be sending out this recording and the slides. Thank you so much for excellent questions, everyone. And thank you so much, Adam and Patrick, for that super informative presentation. I think we all learned a lot. So really appreciate everyone coming tonight. Please share this with your friends and family and colleagues. The more people know about it, the better. Yeah, and we'll share follow-up information so you can take it from here. Any final words, Adam or Patrick?
Just a big thank you to everybody who spent time to come out and hear our presentation. And thanks so much for our kids. Really amazing network, bringing a lot of really amazing solutions for people to take action. So just grateful for everybody. And we hope to keep the conversation going.
Yeah, thanks to the folks at For Our Kids for hosting, Gabrielle and Lela. That was a lot of work. Thanks a lot. And just thanks for everyone taking the time of their day to join us tonight.